Open your Bibles to Philippians chapter 4, if you would. Philippians chapter 4. We'll pick back up into our study. Appreciate Randy covering for me last Sunday. That was a planned event. I appreciate Bill covering Sunday night. That was an unplanned event. We had fully intended to be back Sunday afternoon and for me to preach Sunday night. And the schedule kind of changed on us down there where we were. And so I scrambled around and started messaging people Sunday morning. And actually, I think we funneled it through Sherry because I don't even, do you even carry a cell phone, Bill? I don't even know whether you got one. But anyway, she's got it, right? So I sent a message to Sherry anyway. I appreciate Bill covering for me Sunday night, kind of in a last minute kind of way. In Philippians chapter 4, we talked about this last Wednesday, a week ago, and how this kind of really, this narrative in this moment of this letter really speaks to the heart of what Christian living is about and the kind of mindset and character that each of us should have as followers of Jesus. There's a lot to really talk about in some ways here in this portion. As he early on he beseeches, he talks about a couple fellows that weren't thinking in agreement, and obviously there seems to be a conflict between them, and Paul says, you guys need to get that fixed. And that's my translation, but I think that's what he's saying. He's saying to these guys, you need to resolve this. There's problems, there's difficulties, challenges among these men. And anytime you got a conflict, even if it's just two people that the problem itself is surrounding, does it usually only affect those two people? No. In families, two people can be squabbling, but it affects what? It affects the whole family. And in a congregation, two people can be squabbling, but it affects the whole family. It affects the whole congregation. And so Paul's telling these guys, you guys need to come together and get this sorted and become of the same mind and start heading in the same direction. And then he encourages them to remember some folks who are fellow laborers and helpers, particularly whom? Right, and women. And there were some ladies that were helpful and beneficial in Paul's work and cause, and he commends them to that congregation as well. And beautiful sentiment, really, when you think about it at the end of verse 3. What does he say about them? Yeah, their names are in the book of life. What a better testimony could there be than Paul's compliment to them that these are people whose God has recognized. These folks' names are in the book of life and acknowledged of the Lord as His followers and believers. And so we talked a little bit about that last Wednesday. We talked about the importance of joy in our lives there in verse 5. We talked about, or in verse 4. We talked about that God intended for joy to permeate every aspect of our life. It doesn't mean that everything that ever happens to us or everything occurrence that ever happens is going to be fun and enjoyable. But when you sum up the life of a Christian, when you put it all together collectively, then God says there, I want joy to permeate throughout that. Rejoice. He says, again I say, rejoice. And notice he says, rejoice in where? In the Lord. He understands where true joy is. Generally speaking, we rob ourselves of genuine joy the minute we walk outside of a relationship with God. We may find temporary joy in earthly pleasures. We may find things that make us happy in a moment. But the only kind of real sustaining joy that is meaningful and deep in its greatest sense is in our relationship with God. And He brings a joy and contentment and a peace that passeth what? That passeth understanding. It goes beyond our ability to even intellectually appreciate. And so joy was something that he mentioned. And then we didn't get into verse 5. So this is about where we stopped. He said, let your moderation be known unto all men. The Lord is at hand. So what do you think he's talking about there? Let your gentleness be known unto all men. Okay. Your fair-mindedness. Patience. Okay. Reasonableness. Generally, when you see the word moderation, here's the challenge sometimes. When we see the word moderation, what do we generally think of? Yeah. Thank you for going straight to the chase, right? But yeah, or some other addictive behavior. Whether it be drinking and so generally some people say, well, don't be addicted, but have moderation. But that's not really Paul's subject matter here. So that's why the word is hard. It's difficult for us. If we use King James language here, when he uses the word moderation, that's a difficult word. Because we just assume that he means you can do something that otherwise might be extreme, like drunkenness, but just keep it in moderation. You do something that's extreme, or don't do something that's extreme, but as long as you moderate it, then it's okay. And that's not the point Paul's driving at here, especially when you think of it contextually. Let your moderation be known unto all men. The Lord is at hand. That doesn't seem to fit that kind of thinking. The idea here, I think, is the idea of patience and gentleness and kindness and your relationship towards one another as we work to that end. Let me just real quick. Go ahead, Bob. I'm listening. Yeah, yeah, and not given to excess. But again, and that is a definition of the word moderation. What we're dealing with here is, number one, the definition of appropriate, that which is appropriate, that which is mild, that which is gentle, moderate, or patient. Those are the defining terms of the original Greek word here in this passage. And so I think Paul's trying to encourage us. Let your conduct, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. He just warned two fellows that they need to be what? Like-minded, get together, quit being quarrelsome, right? Don't have this turmoil. Let your gentleness, let your patience, let your appropriate behavior, let your moderate behavior, let your mild behavior be known unto all men. Yeah, yeah. And so let men know that we're not the kind of folks that have no moderation about us. And so in some senses we do use the word that way. Don't let us become folks that have no gentleness and no mild and meekness. We're just full board all the way all the time. Men need to see us a little differently to give the character of God. Yeah, there's all kinds of ways that would produce itself, or the fruit that would be produced from that characteristic. Yeah. And there may be some of that in the way people see the character that we have. Add verse 6. Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. As a character issue, as a person, we're moderate, we're mild. We don't get anxious and worrisome and troubled. We maintain a mild and moderate view of those things, and rather than get anxious and worrisome and troubled, what do we do instead? Yeah, we pray and we give our supplications and we show our appreciation and thanksgiving. And when we lack or we have need, we what? We ask. We make our requests known unto God. I believe these thoughts are connected here in some ways, where he challenges us in a personal character mode to not get to become overly excessive in our approach towards things and lack patience and lack a certain level of gentleness and character about the way we walk through life that gives the wrong impression about what children of God are. Children of God need to be giving the impression that we're prayerful and we're patient and that we petition the Father when we're troubled by something. We make our requests known. That's the imagery that God desires for us to portray. And the result of that is what? Verse 7. Add that last thought. And the peace. So the connector there, right? Do all these things. Let your moderation be known. Remember the Lord is at hand. What's it mean the Lord's at hand, by the way? Yeah, He's available. He's available. He's at hand. He's available to us. And so don't be anxious and worrisome and troubled. Remember the Lord is at hand. So don't be anxious. Be prayerful instead. Be appreciative. Make your requests known. And then the resulting of that action is the peace of God which passeth all understanding shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Some translations do use guard. Shall guard your heart. Anybody have that word there? Shall guard your heart and minds through Christ Jesus. The soul, the heart, the core of man is in many ways the most vulnerable of who we are, right? We talk about those who are brokenhearted. I'm not going to break out into a country song, but you know, right? We talk about those who when you break somebody's spirit, that's hard to recover from. It's one thing to have to recover from physical ailments and difficulties and challenges. Those have their own issues. But when somebody becomes brokenhearted, when their spirit is broken, when the very inner being of who they are is shattered, that's hard to overcome. And so the best way, in some ways, maybe in a sense, to protect the heart from that, he says, is build this character relationship with God. Let your supplications and thanksgivings and requests be made known to Him, and He'll protect your heart. He'll give you that peace that passeth understanding. He'll guard that heart when the challenges come and the difficulties come. But here's what, and I've said this under other narratives as well, but I'll share it with you in this context. The problem we have is we generally try to wait for trouble to come, then we want to build the barrier. But it's too late. The difficulties already come in. The trouble's already arrived. When do I need to build this barrier of protection that has peace that passeth understanding? Before it comes, right? That's why I'm prayerful. That's why I'm making my requests known. That's why I'm living in moderation. That's why I'm developing the kind of spirit and character that God would have, so that I'm not trying to rush around and build a fence around myself and my heart when the problem arises. And so often we wait too long to build the barrier. And because of that, we find ourselves in more difficult straits than we need to be. If we had just let God protect us and guard our hearts by devoting ourselves to Him in greater ways. Yeah, and generally speaking, we do. Sometimes, Jim, and sometimes maybe we feel pretty contented in the moment. And so when we get contented, sometimes we let our guard down. We don't stay as steadfast and as convicted and committed as we should. I'll come back to you, Bob. Go ahead, Randy. Yeah. 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 I'm at hand. It's the same sentiment that Paul states here, that when Jesus encourages folks to appreciate that I'm right here. And that should produce a strength and a conviction about us. And a peace about us as well. I heard another voice, I think. Right. Yeah. Right. And sometimes language is hard because there's a sense where he's saying here, don't be careful, don't be anxious, don't be so overwhelmed by those things that you forget this relationship that can walk with you through it and guide you through it. But on the other hand, at other times he does tell us to be concerned about responsibilities and accountabilities that we have. When Paul talks about preachers within the New Testament, if you recall, he spoke about himself being in the best circumstance as far as being a preacher because he didn't have family and those extra responsibilities. He wasn't married, didn't have children, so he didn't have those extra concerns. But he says anybody that does has to be concerned about those things. You have to be accountable and responsible to those things. So this seems to be more of an anxiety and worrisome, and to the point where I almost neglect, as if God doesn't provide me any peace and comfort. And accountability is a little different to some things. Yeah, I'm listening. Why didn't you tell me that 15 minutes ago? I shouldn't say ask my mom on live broadcast. Troublesome. If I can remember how. I thought I set it up already. Hang on. I should have just said no, and I could have just kept going on. There you go. My bad. So you're allowed to flag me down, by the way. You might have been trying to do that for the last 15 minutes. I don't know. So anyway, so the peace of God was passed from understanding, verse 7. Now, finally, brethren, verse 8. Here's kind of Paul's summation. Here's some things that I need you to consider as I begin to wrap up this letter to you. Whatsoever things are, what's the first one? True. Let's read them all first. Whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things. And so we might at times view these handful of things as actions. We act honest, or we act truthful, but where's the emphasis he's placing? Where I think on them. Paul understands, the wisdom of God understands, that we don't act in ways that we don't first think about. Now, the problem is, now you might say, well, I've done all kinds of things and had the consequences because I did them before I thought them through, right? There's a difference. You still thought it, right? You didn't say it if you didn't think it. You didn't act upon it if you didn't think it. The thought came. Our problem is we don't think enough things through. We don't give enough consideration to the right kinds of things. And our responses and reactions and statements and words sometimes in life reflect that. I mean, who among us would want to raise their hand tonight and try to claim that we've never had a moment where we never said anything, or we've never said anything, or never acted impetuously, or we've never, done something without thinking it through? We've all been there. We've all been in moments where if we had stopped and thought a little more, if we'd stopped and considered maybe the full ramifications or full consequence of what I was about to do or say, maybe I would have stopped. So how do I get to that mindset? How do I build a character? How do I build a process in my own life that lets me have the right attitudes and actions outwardly? And here's where it happens. I get the mind going in the right direction. Go ahead, Randy. Yeah. Yeah. And these I don't even know how to even phrase it in some ways, but these thinking characteristics and qualities, when we're trying to figure out, well, how should I approach this situation? How should I react to this moment? How should I respond to what this person just said or did? If I've built this as my mode of thinking about things, then I'm going to process this the right way. Because the first thing I'm going to ask then is what? Is it true? What I'm hearing, seeing, experiencing in that moment, the first process here of my thinking, is it true? Because whether something is true or false really in many ways sets the stage or defines what kind of response I should have. Correct? Go ahead, Bill.
I always looked at this verse, maybe others have too. If we can occupy our mind with these things,
Yeah.
the bad things don't have the time or the
Yeah.
to get in our mind.
Yeah. And there's truth to that. Because the truth is we only have so much, as smart as we may be at times, there's only so much room. And the more time and energy my mind is put towards this, the less time it has to even entertain something to the contrary. And there's benefit in that. Yep. Oh, go ahead. I'll come back. That's all right. Yeah. 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 To a degree, to varying degrees, the world accepts a lack of all of these things at one point or another, and to varying degrees and levels. And there's compromises on truth to certain levels. And generally speaking, people are willing to compromise truth and honesty and purity and all of these things when they believe it benefits them. The minute it disadvantages them, then they completely think differently all of a sudden. Now all of a sudden they want truth and they want what's right and they want what's pure and they want right. And that's the problem we have. It's just fine and dandy for me to be dishonest at times and untruthful at times and cheat at times, and so long as it's just me being benefited. But the minute somebody brings those same dispositions to me, well, the challenge for us is to not be distracted by that. To say to ourselves, this is how I'm going to be. I'd love to influence the world if I can, but at bare minimum, this is what I'm going to be. And hopefully that will encourage those at least around me to think the same. Go ahead, Baba. Is that you back? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. And we'll definitely talk about that here in a second. So, first question, is it true or is it false? The second thing, is it what? Is it honest? I thought truth and honesty are the same thing. Not necessarily. Let me biblically illustrate that for you. Abraham ends up in Egypt. Pharaoh asks, who's this woman with you? What's he say? That's my sister. Is that true? Is it honest? No. Right? It was accurately true. She was his half-sister. It was accurately true. But it was deceptively dishonest. Because Pharaoh wasn't asking, are you related? He's asking, is she your wife? That's what, because what's his intent? Yeah, if she's not, she's mine now. That was his intent, and Abraham knew it. Now, we can talk all day long about his fears and his concerns and what would happen to him and what would happen to her. I get all that, but it still doesn't excuse it. And who had to intervene to fix it? God did. God had to intervene and basically tell Pharaoh, you better not. And Pharaoh brings her back and says, you guys you've disturbed and caused me heartache and trouble over this. But that's an illustration. First answer or question is it true or false? But that's not enough when we're thinking and processing things that are happening in front of us. Because there may be an element of truth, but that might not be efficient enough to answer the question. The next layer is now, okay, is it honest? Is it just, for lack of a better description, is it just literal truth that I'm trying to advantage myself in? Well, I'll give you one more quick illustration. Did Satan tell the truth about the Scriptures when he tempted Jesus in Matthew chapter 4? Yes, he did. But was he honest about what those Scriptures meant? No. So you understand the difference between the two. You begin with true and false, but then the second level is this honest? Are you being honest about this? Are you being not just truthful, but is there a level of honesty about it? So think that way. Because I think that will help us go that one extra step. Because sometimes we justify all kinds of things. We say, well, it's true, right? Well, it's true. Well, but is it honest? The next layer. And then what? Is it just? Is right? Okay? So we're peeling back the layers here, and we're as we're thinking, before we respond, before we react, before we do anything, we ask, is it truth? If it's not, then we need to stay away from it. That's warning number one. Is it honest? Well, if it has a kernel of truth, but it's really being dishonest in the way it's being used, then that's not the right way to think. Now, is it right? Is it just? When we think about the things that we see and witness and hear from others, before we ever repeat it, say it, react to it, we need to ask ourselves, is this fair? Is the decision or choice or conclusion I've made, is it a just and fair conclusion? Or have I been distracted by bias? Have I heard a one-sided conversation and I'm already making opinions and decisions about that? Truth and honesty are the first two levels, but the next level of thinking about things is this just? Am I treating people fairly in the way that I'm responding? And then what? It's pure. That's the kind of thing that we want to have in our minds. We want to think I want to think pure thoughts. And friends, by the way, that may have a personal connotation to it, and I get that. There may be a level of thought that I want my mind to be pure. I want to think about things that are pure. I don't want to be bombarded in my mind and the way I think about things with things that would be considered impure in the eyes of God. But as it relates to building a character that helps me respond to others, I don't want to have impure thoughts about others either. Not just personal impure thoughts, but I don't want to think bad about others. I don't want impurity to affect how I respond and react to other people. And be cautioned about that. Whatsoever things are then lovely. We become products of the things that we put into our minds. That's what Paul's warning us about here. And we can be programmed behaviorally to think negatively about everything. I don't know how else to say this, but I'm just going to give you food for thought to consider. If you or I, if every time we hear anything about anyone or anything or any situation, if our first reaction is negative, if we have something smart aleck to say about it every single time, if we've always got, that's just the crummiest this and the crummiest that, and they don't have any good quality whatsoever, if we're always putting down everything and everyone and every situation, we're not thinking lovely. Okay? We're dishonoring what God is teaching us through the Apostle Paul here. If we react with lack of love towards others, even when they don't do what we want them to do, and even when they don't fulfill certain responsibilities, since when do Christians have liberty just because somebody didn't do what was right or didn't do what they were supposed to do? Do I have right to chew them out or act unchristian-like towards them just because they, in my mind, treated me unfairly or unkind? My job is to think lovely and pure and honest and right and good. That's my reaction. That's my obligation. Now, I'm not standing here telling you that I've not been guilty of the same thing. I've been guilty of the same thing. Jumping straight to a negative thought when I shouldn't be. And it's something we need to work on. Don't just say, well, that's just the way I am. We excuse way too many things. Side point, I apologize, but I'll get in a soapbox and I'll jump off of it. But we excuse ourselves way too much like that. We say, well, that's just the way I am. Well, if it's not lovely and good report and honest and pure and true, then change. God's saying change. You can't just excuse ourselves and say, well, that's just the way I am, if it doesn't fit what God's asking us to be. Not if we want to be His follower. And vice versa. Sometimes we say that of others. We say, well, that's just the way He is. Well, if He's a child of God and He's not honoring the character and attitude and disposition that God desires, then He can't just be the way He is. God wants Him to be something different. And it begins with the way that we think. We've got to start thinking better. What sort of things? What kind of report? Good report. I'm not asking for a raising hands. I just want you to think about it. The last time you heard something negative or bad, did you have the temptation to want to tell the first person you came in contact with about that negative or bad thing? Did you feel the urge? You no more than heard it, and you in your mind thought, I got to tell the next person I see her. Well, He said, no. He said, that's not the way God's children think. God's children want to focus on that which is good and that which is pure. We want to hear the good report. That's the mindset of child of God. And we've got to learn from this. I've got to learn from this narrative. What's virtue? By the way, by definition, it's moral excellence. If there be any moral, in other words, all of these things are about what? Morals. These are morals. Sometimes we say that's a good moral man. Well, you want the definition of a good moral man? There he is. He's a guy that thinks this way. Philippians 4, verse 8. Good moral man isn't just about a guy that never strayed on his wife and fed his children all his life. Well, those are good qualities, right? That doesn't necessarily make him a good moral man. This is what makes him a good moral man. One who has virtue. If there be any moral excellence, he's summarizing now, right? Gave us the details. Now here's the summation. If there's any moral excellence, if there's anything worthy of what? Praise, think on these things. You want to talk about things that are praiseworthy, characteristics that are honorable, characteristics that are of high quality, that make a man moral or woman moral. Here they are. Think on these things. This is what should define us from our very inner being. You're fine, Gary. Go ahead. Go ahead. And 1 Corinthians 13 is the exact parallel to what Paul's talking to these folks here in Philippians about. It's the same basic principles that he's guiding them to that they need to appreciate. And it's a perfect parallel.
We're bombarded 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with how bad this world is. There's nothing good ever come like on the news. Everything bad.
Yeah.
Gets people upset.
Yeah. And I want to go back, because, Jim, there's something I think an important principle here, and we briefly said it, but I want to come back to it for a moment. I like what he said there at the end, where he says, and if there be any praise, if there's any value, if there's something, if it's going to be praiseworthy, something that you ought to give your time and energy to, let it be these things. These are the things that are praiseworthy. These are worth your time and energy. I try not to embarrass Deborah when she's in here, so I'll embarrass her when she's not in here. But she's the best. She's the best ever, in every way to me. But she to me is the best about this. See, I'll sit and listen to negative thoughts. I'll sit and listen. People want to come and say, and they'll go down this negative road, and I'm, whether it's my not wanting to be rude, or maybe the truth is maybe I want to hear it, and that's flaw, right? But she's the best. When somebody starts going down that road, if I start going down that road, just walk away. Because she wants to honor this. She's not interested. When you start walking down a negative road, and I'm not saying if somebody was in worldliness and they needed to be corrected, but if you just start walking down a negative path, if she ever walks away from you, you know you're down a negative path, because that's just, she doesn't want to. Her mind doesn't want that. She doesn't want to hear it, and I love her for it because she educates me by that characteristic. Now, nobody tell her I said that because she'll be embarrassed. So I'll get out. But you understand what I'm talking about. That's the quality that we should have. That's where we should be. I want to think on things that are good, right, pure, wholesome, good report. That's what I want. That's what I want in my mind, because that'll improve me. That'll make me better. And we need to work to that end. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. 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 And since you took us down that road, I'll walk with you. I'll chase it for a moment, because what that says, Bonnie, and you're right. What that says then is, the longer I've been at this, the better I should be, not worse. If I've been a child of God for a longer period of time, then I should be working towards improving the honesty and pure, the way that I think. And so that's a challenge to all of us that have been around a while. That some behaviors, for lack of a better description, you might understand a new convert is struggling, trying to work towards these things. But those of us who have had lots of years to grow and mature ought to really be the examples of this for others. And I'm not saying you didn't say you weren't. You know what I'm saying. Go ahead, Randy. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. It builds the kind of character that helps keep me from heading down that same path, and thinking and reacting and responding in the same sinful ways that I may be addressing and dealing with. And I'm not trying to imply at all that there aren't sinful things that have to be dealt with, and challenging, and yes, sometimes hurtful and negative things that have to be dealt with. I'm more inclined, or more leaning towards, in my discussion, about just talk, just gossipy, chattery talk that tends to be negative about everything. It's just not worth it. I don't have enough time. My mind doesn't need to have it filled with that stuff, and that's really where I was with that. You're absolutely right. But this builds the character to deal with real situations where somebody's soul's in jeopardy because they're walking a worldly path. And then I apply these same characteristics, but being honest and truthful and lovely means not letting them continue to walk a path without some effort. Yeah. 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 Without the kind of spiritual maturity these texts are leading us to, we're not going to be as well equipped as we need to be. when those situations arise. So those things which you have both learned and received and heard and seen in me, what's the operative word? Do. Do them. So God said, or Paul says, there's been lots of ways you've learned them, you've received them, you've heard them, and you've seen them. There's various ways that education can come, right? I think that's kind of what Paul's driving at here. There's all kinds of ways that they can be educated in the right way to function and act as a child of God. Some of those things are learned by the experiences of life. Sometimes we learn these along the way, and we see where these qualities would have aided or helped in a situation, and we grow through the process. Some of them we received and heard them. Sometimes they were given to us. The education was provided. Didn't have to be kind of learned through experience. It was provided to us. And sometimes we get education by what? Looking at others, he said. Right? That can be positive and negative, by the way. That can go both ways. We can learn at times what to do, and we can also learn what not to do. But his specific focus is what? What things to do. What you've seen in me, do them. Back to Bob's point a little bit ago then. These things aren't just good Bible study material, right? These things aren't just good to have a discussion about, which is wonderful here in a Bible class setting. These are things to go out and live. These are things to go out and do. These are things to go out and implement into our lives. And what's the result? And the God of peace shall be with you. Now, I realize what I'm about to say is going to sound oversimplified, and it's not quite this simplified. I get that. So there's my disclaimer. But let me challenge you and I. In those moments where we feel like maybe the God of peace is not with me, then maybe the first step isn't, why isn't God with me? And looking to Him as if He's failed in some way. To maybe come and look at me and say, okay, am I living up to these qualities? And again, I realize it's an oversimplified thing. It's more complicated than that. But that's a start anyway. To begin to examine, well, maybe I'm distant from Him, or I don't feel like I'm close to Him because I've let my mind go. My mind's been on other things than that which is good and pure and right and true and honest. I've let my mind go away from God. And so when my mind went away from God, my life went away from God. And so He's challenging them and us. You abide in these things. You do them. When you've learned it, and you've received it, and you've heard, and you've been educated, then do them. And then the God of peace will be with you. But I rejoice, verse 10, in the Lord greatly, that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein ye were also careful, but ye lacked opportunity. So there was a reciprocal kind of relationship between them, Paul, and the church there at Philippi. There were times where they were doing what for Paul? Helping in what way? Just not to insult. Yeah, financially or however you want to define it, but for his basic needs and care. And so he says, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein you were also careful, but ye lacked opportunity. So Paul basically says, I know you've always wanted to help and aid in my care. There apparently, he doesn't define why, but there was apparently a period of time where they couldn't do it, but now they are able again. So they helped for a while, then the opportunity, ability, whatever was not there any longer, but he says now at the last again, you've been able to help. And he's paying respect for that. He's showing appreciation for the fact that they were willing to give assistance and aid to him as he preaches and works in the cause of Christ, even in this moment of imprisonment. And then I appreciate what Paul says here. He says, not that I speak in respect of want. He's appreciative that they're helped, but I don't say that, Paul says, because I'm wanting something. It's not about want, for I've learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be what? Content. Paul said, now remember what he just said. What you've seen, learned, received, heard. When you look at my example, he says to them, listen, I've learned to try to be content. In whatever circumstance or whatever state that I've found myself in. I know how to what? I need to be abased, King James, which is basically, how would we say that? Poor, right? That's in some senses, lowly, right? Without. I've learned to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be what? Hungry. Both to abound and to suffer need. Which of those do you think was easier for Paul? He learned contentment in whatever state he was in. But let's be honest about the human condition. It was probably a lot simpler from him in a human condition standpoint to not be hungry. From a human condition standpoint, it would have been a lot easier for him to not be abased. He said, and keep in mind, this statement comes on the heels of him thanking them for what? Sending the support back again, right? There was a period of time where the opportunity wasn't there, but now you are again, and I'm thankful for that because it seems to me, and maybe I'm reading between the lines too much here, but if I'm sitting in Philippi and I had sent money, then I had to stop sending money, and then I sent it again, and then Paul says, thank you for beginning to do that again. I've learned to be abased, and I've learned to abound, and I've tried to learn to be content in either one of those. The impression I get is, while they were unable to send, that's when he was on the bottom of that description. Once they were able to renew that, he experiences the opposite end of that perspective. And that's just, and again, I hope I'm not reading between the lines too much in the letter, but that's what I see. That Paul's thanking them because I've learned to be abased while you weren't able, when you didn't have opportunity. I've also learned to abound while you're helping me. And so his point is twofold. Number one, I've learned to be content. Let me add verse 13 and I'll come to you, Jim. But the end result is I can do what? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That statement, by the way, I'm okay with using it as a generic principle, and we do that sometimes. But I also want to appreciate it in its context. Paul said that under the thought of how he had learned to abound and be abased in his preaching of the gospel in terms of his physical needs. That statement is made not isolated from the conversation. The statement is made in relationship to what he just said. And so he says, I made it through because of the strength of Christ. I was able to be content while I didn't have much, while I was hungry, while I was in need, while you couldn't continue to support me. I learned to be content in that because Christ provided the strength. That's the contextual way that he makes that statement. Now it has some principle meaning as well, I'm sure. Okay. Lord willing, I'll return to that statement Sunday morning. I'm going to set out for you. We're going to go, I was looking at kind of my materials over the last couple of years. I've been out of the Old Testament for a while. I didn't realize how long until I actually went back and looked. And it's actually maybe in a couple of years since we've done anything in the Old Testament. And so I want to go, I have not done the minor prophets here. And so we're going to jump back to the minor prophets. We did Jonah at one point, but I want to jump back. So we may not do Jonah, but I want to go back and do the other minor prophets. So there's an introduction to that study, because I think before we can talk about the minor prophets, we need to talk about